Welcome back. This is section 3.3 of the Fit to Respond, Fit to Retire certification. This section is going to be going through the compounding effects of the issues we discussed in the previous presentation, and we're going to look at what can be done and what has been put out in the past by who, addressing what specific areas of the issues that we've discussed. And I found that there is a wealth of information out there that we haven't tapped into and that I haven't really come across just because of the difficulty in finding the information. But after a little bit of digging, I found some things that I believe are really valuable, and I wanted to present them in this way so that you understood where they came from, where to go to find more, and then also how we can work together to make this program work. To start out, I want to go over two studies in particular. This one was comprised of 3,289 firefighters, and they found that there was a significant association between work-related injury, burnout syndrome, PTSD symptoms, age, work experience, and physical condition. So the correlation of that compounding effect is shown here. This was published in Occupational Medicine back in 2016. This was a research paper published by the Eastern Michigan University School of Fire Staff and Command. And I'll just read what they had in their paper. It said, local government entities may view physical fitness programs as a quick fix for problems associated with firefighter paramedic work, when in fact comprehensive wellness technologies are required to enhance the viability of firefighter personnel at all ranks and levels of experience. So based on those two studies together, I think that gives you a good idea of what we're going to review as we move forward through this presentation, but also that it can't be one area of health and wellness that we spend the majority of our time on. For each individual, it's going to be different. And for the fire department as a whole, it needs to be a program that synergistically works with each piece within it. Some of you have heard this analogy in the past from me. It's one of my favorites, but because I think it really paints a good picture of that allostatic limit and the capacity that we all have, and the individual capacity that we all have, as well as the ability to process stress out and manage it. So Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman says, think of your body as a bathtub and stress is the water that pours in. Now the drain can only release so much, so the water comes in so fast that the drain cannot handle it. The water begins to rise. If it rises too high, it overflows and damages the floor. If 5 gallons are suddenly added to the tub, you've got to get out from under the faucet for a couple of days to let the water stress subside. You have to be able to control your stress throughout your entire life. If you are in good physical shape, your tub is a little larger and you can handle a little more water before you overflow. The best way to make your drain bigger so that you process stress out faster is to engage in appropriate management dynamics. And that's what we're trying to develop here, is that appropriate management dynamics for the Salt Lake City Fire Department. This situation was tragic, and I by no means want to sit back here and act like I would have prevented this or seen it coming or any of that. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is paint a picture of this disaster that had happened and the fact that we're vulnerable to a disaster that could happen within this fire department. And the analogy that I'd like to make is that they knew that the levees were failing. They knew that they needed to spend some money on fixing the levees and reinforcing those, but decided to put that money in other areas. So this is the consequence. And they had experts warning them, telling them, hey, we need to get this done. If a big storm comes, it's going to destroy our levees. And the storm came and it destroyed the levees. This next quote, I think, will illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. When is a disaster not a disaster? When the community is prepared to respond appropriately. This quote is true for what we do as firefighters, as well as the health and wellness program and the literal disaster we just looked at. It's not a disaster when we can manage the scene and prevent the loss of life. And that's true for our health and wellness program, and it's true for a literal disaster in someone's life. And that's what we do as firefighters. We do our best to limit disaster from getting worse. We manage what we can't stop or what has already happened. And in the rare circumstance, we get an opportunity to turn things around as if it never happened. And that's, I think, why we're all in this job, is for that opportunity to really impact someone's life, whether it be a structure fire that we can stop, or a medical situation where we can intervene and provide the interventions necessary to prolong life and give the individual an opportunity to overcome that disaster. So, what can we do, and where do we start here with our health and wellness program? We got to continue to build what we have so far, because it's not even close to being a full structure where it can stand on its own. And that's going to take multiple people, and it's going to take all of us, and hopefully the continuous buy-in of our administration and the union. We need to understand the basic physiology and psychology involved. We got to understand what can be changed, and then provide education on what can't be, so that firefighters can have that ownership piece and do what they need to do to limit the damage of what can't be. And one of the ways we figure out what can and can't be changed is performing needs assessments. And these are things that we do individually, and they're things that we can do as a fire department. We provide programs aimed at developing a growth mindset and resiliency. We address the 3 areas of recovery to make sure that when it comes to that disaster in our own lives, that we're not gonna block it with some busted up levees. And just like Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman said, we need to step away after it overflows and runs onto the floor. The stress overflows and runs onto the floor. And that's because it's going to create damage as well. And sometimes we need to step away, assess the damage, and figure out what it's going to take to fix it. And I think that's just part of the job. We're going to run into that. And we got to maintain our health and wellness so that it's not a constant process, and so that it's not damage on damage, and we have a brittle, busted up structure that could collapse any minute. This is an example of a needs analysis that we did here for the Salt Lake City Fire Department, looking at specific areas of musculoskeletal injuries and where exactly those injuries happened on the job. And I think this is a valuable tool, but we could make it a lot better. I think knowing the time of day would be really valuable, but this is a place to start, and we've already got some programs in place based on this needs analysis, and it's mostly to do with the back and core injuries that are happening. That number you see there is not an exact number. This is for the past 3 years, and we weren't able to get the complete set of data for the last year. So I think that number's around 34 for back injuries, which is 10% of the job. And back injuries aren't something that just go away. A lot of times they're a chronic, lifelong issue. So we got to do our best to prevent those, and figure out how to manage the injuries that we have. We're now going to get into the ways we can prevent injuries and the information that's out there in regard to fire departments, and in general. There's some great information out there. So we're going to take a look at some of it right now. And please, if you have any thing to add to this, let me know and I'll get that information out there. This is a letter that was in the introduction of a health and wellness program that was put out by the United States Fire Administration back in 1991. So the information within that was a little bit outdated, but still relevant in a lot of ways. And this quote here, I think, is a great one. It says, "Stress is one of the most serious occupational hazards facing the modern fire service. It's important to recognize exactly how stress can adversely affect our health, job performance, career decision making, morale, and family life. We also know that a certain amount of stress is essential for maintaining our vitality." So I like it because it's addressing the issues that are out in the fire service, but also that stress isn't the enemy. It's our ability to manage it, and the lack of recovery, I think, is the issue. And that's one of the things that they reviewed in this presentation. Let's go through it a little bit here. They say in this program, participants will learn about fire service stress and how to apply sound stress managing principles for the purpose of minimizing the health ravaging and costly consequences of excessive stress. Participants will learn how to become active, competent architects of career and life. So they give 3 basic types of stress control techniques, and it is the holistic approach. Basically what we're trying to do here at Salt Lake City. It is first, what can we change in the environment around us to limit stress and to optimize our autonomy, and then techniques that operate on the mind and our cognitive ability, and then on the body. Environmental stress control steps. We need to be able to identify the stressor and discern if that stress can be avoided. And then after we figure out if it can or cannot be, we need to understand it and then generate alternatives and evaluate those and make a decision. And then after, similar to our fatigue management system, we create another loop to make sure that that thing that we did as an alternative is the right thing to do, and it actually did reduce the amount of stress in our lives. Cognitive stress techniques, and this is going to help with resiliency as well. I've taken some of these things from other references that are cited at the end of this presentation, but some of it also did come from that article that I just had mentioned. So the mindset is going to be primary, because if it's fixed, we're not going to be able to see opportunity for growth. We're not going to be able to move past some of the issues that we have, because basically, we'll get into this a little bit more in this presentation, but the fixed mindset is a belief that things are what they are, and I am who I am, and the amount of change that can happen is limited to non-existent. So we need to change that, because that's not true, obviously. So we do that by cultivating optimism and telling ourselves a more accurate way to look at this is, or I can look at this from another person's perspective to understand it better. And then we need to gather evidence if our thought process is true or not, and then gain an understanding through those things on how we can progress through whatever issues that we're facing. It's important to understand what we react to and our triggers. So that would be called an activating event, and that could produce either a positive or negative response. And we need to understand what our beliefs are, heat of the moment, thoughts, opinions, interpretations, and then consequences. What happens when we have those thoughtless reactions? And this is it's asking uh, firefighters to be thoughtful about how they live life and do a little introspection from time to time. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially when we're fatigued beyond our capacity. This tool was taken from the Army Master Resiliency Program, which is a good article that is referenced at the end of this presentation as well. And it's reviewing thinking traps, which are associated with the fixed mindset. And they're similar to that first tool. I like this one. It's just a little bit different, and it may be a little easier to remember. So I added it. And those steps are: we need to be flexible. We need to have accurate understanding. So do our research. We need to be thorough in that research so that we can come up with an understanding and a way to improve. Physical stress control and recovery is broken down into two groups, and I like how they've done this because of the nature of stress. And if we're stressed out mentally, it's going to affect our bodies and vice versa. So the centralized approach starts with the mind. So we go from the mind out is what I get from that. And the peripheral, that starts with the body and then connecting the body to the mind. And this is a skill that is going to increase performance overall because it's a mindful practice, number one, and that's going to help us cognitively function with improved performance. But also, this is going to improve that neuromuscular connection. And one thing that I like to do is strength training, because with strength training, you're trying to tell your muscle group to fire, and you're trying to get that full muscle group to fire as you lift a certain amount of weight. And we're going to talk more about that here in a minute, but that's a way that we can get that peripheral physical stress control in the training. And getting the biggest bang for our buck, I think, is really something we need to look at, because we don't want to spend hours in the gym. We're busy as is, and if there's extra time, we probably should spend it sleeping. So that's one thing I'd like to go over together, is how can we combine some of these things to create a program that is time efficient. These are some stress management tools that I found that are specific to our job, and that doesn't mean that they're perfect for what we need and that we should use them. I just thought that they were worth including, and they're actually a part of the firefighter readiness check. The questions that are in that check are basically a screen to send an individual to the next screen or questionnaire, which would be one of these. And we'll go through these individually. The firefighter coping self-efficacy scale was taken from a more generic self-efficacy scale, and basically studies have been done to prove that it's effective in recognition of lack of coping ability. And they found in one of the studies that we have listed here that firefighters who perceived higher competence for coping with work-related demands reported fewer psychological symptoms. And some also reported greater perceived autonomy, a sense of environmental mastery, and purpose in life. Just as we discussed in the previous presentation, perception is everything, and that's developed over time. That's something that we can work on, just like we can work on mindfulness and physical fitness. So this is a good assessment on how well we're coping with the difficulty of the job and the stress of the job. The Professional Quality of Life Scale was a questionnaire developed for the helper professions. And the term burnout actually was created for those professions, which are basically firemen, policemen, uh, hospital workers, any helper profession that you can imagine that are public service type professions. And it's assessing compassion fatigue, which is the precursor to burnout. This is the 7 C's of stress exposure management. And I got this from the Behavioral Health Management Guide that was put together by the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. It's pretty good information. And this is a tool that can be used for yourself or for another person. And it's another good guideline. Some of you may be familiar with this tool. It's common throughout law enforcement, and Captain Crandall has used it in the past in some of his trainings. It was developed by Colonel John Boyd, who was a fighter pilot in the 1950s, and he was known for being the pilot who changed the art of war. As I was researching this tool, I came across a quote that is definitely applicable to our purposes here. He says, "Any man facing a major decision acts, consciously or otherwise, upon the training and beliefs of a lifetime. Orientation shapes the way we interact with the environment. Hence, orientation shapes the way we decide and the way we act." This is a tool that seems simple at first glance, but as you can see, you can dissect each one of these words, and not only that, you can prepare to have the correct orientation and decision and action and observation, and in training you can develop this process that is continuous throughout a scenario. And this is a process that will help us avoid stumbling over mistakes. Focusing on mindset has become a pretty popular performance psychology strategy, and it was made famous by a psychologist named Carol Dweck, and she wrote a book called Mindset. And she was a psychologist who performed numerous studies on people, and her focus was on how they cope with failure and obstacles, and she wanted to know specifically why some people seek out challenge and why others don't, and they shy away from challenge. So in her book, she goes over the growth and fixed mindset and how to recognize when you're slipping into that fixed mindset. This is a good graphic describing those terms. So basically, the fixed mindset is a desire to look smart, and that leads you to avoid challenges and give up easily, because that's a shallow goal. And the growth mindset is a desire to learn and embrace challenge and persist in the face of setbacks. The individual with a growth mindset is always trying to be better. He's on that path to mastery, and he's looking and seeking out opportunities, and some of those come in the form of criticism, and he also will find lessons and inspiration in the success of others, and that heads in the direction of greater autonomy and sense of free will, whereas the fixed mindset leads to less autonomy, and it's due to the fact that failures in the past are seen as absolute. That if you aren't good at something right when you try it, it seems like the human tendency is to assume that you're just not good at it, because what we see is people doing things and being talented at certain things as just face value. We see it, then we don't see the hours and hours that have been put into practice. So it's easy to get caught up in that fixed mindset, and I think with chronic stress, it's definitely easier. This is a list of some more examples of mindset, and in my mind, it seems to come down to one thing, and that's ownership. if we're willing to see what part of the issues are ours and look at how we can fix those things to make life and our response better in the future, then life is going to have increased autonomy and it's going to be better. But if we continue to make excuses and if we're not willing to see what we need to own, then we're going to slip into that mental injury area and realm. Now we're going to take a look at some of the articles that have been written for the fire service in regard to fatigue management, sleep deprivation. We'll also look at some other recent information that has come out in regard to sleep so that we can figure out what to use as we move forward. This was written by the National EMS Advisory Council, referring to fatigue and the issues that it's causing within the fire service. And I just want to take a look at the bottom sentence here. It says, poor sleep and fatigue among EMS workers represent potential threats to patient care, provider well-being, and the public's health and trust in EMS. So now we'll get into the response to this. The National Association of EMS Officials came out with some recommendations, and they based their recommendations on quality of evidence. It seems like, from my perspective, that there's a problem with the recommendations because each of them only had evidence that was low or very low to support each of these recommendations, which in also my opinion, they're kind of weak, I guess, and we need some more specific interventions, but that's my opinion. If you think differently, please let me know. Let's go through these real quick. Number one is the use of fatigue management surveys, and that's a recommendation that's been around for a little while. It's one that the Wellness and Fitness Initiative has had in there for over 4 years. Shorter shifts, shorter than 24 hours. That one also is not really a viable recommendation, in my opinion, where we're at right now in the fire service. And then I was disappointed with this caffeine recommendation. I know that it definitely helps with fatigue and performance when we're sleep deprived, and we need to use it, there's no doubt, but we also need some guidelines on how to use it maybe a little better so that we don't build up a tolerance and so that it doesn't create that issue of recognition of the problems of fatigue. They also said, number 4, EMS personnel should have the opportunity to nap while on duty to mitigate fatigue. And that's a great one, I think. It's also kind of an obvious one, and hopefully most people are doing that. But I think that the opportunity piece is important to secure with the administration, but I think taking it a little further, it needs to be encouraged, in my mind. EMS personnel should receive education and training to mitigate fatigue and fatigue-related risks. So yeah, that's and it should be done, and we're planning on doing that. The International Association of Fire Chiefs also came out with a fatigue management research paper, basically, and in that they first listed all of the effects of sleep deprivation and the potential consequences. And this paper was written more than 10 years ago, so it was a little bit outdated. And I also referred to this when I put the last presentation together. So that should be all updated information from the last presentation. But let's just go over some of the recommendations that I highlighted here because I think they are valuable. I put in this identifying at-risk workers because it's a pretty common recommendation, and it's to use some sort of survey to see what the need is out there. And understanding individual differences in how they tolerate sleep loss is important, and this was a study that was cited within this paper. and is basically saying that they studied active duty jet pilots, and they found that they all reacted differently to sleep loss. We need to understand the day and night preference, that it's not just a preference, that it's an actual genetic makeup, and it's called chronotype, and we've already talked about that. So it's important to know for yourself what time of day that you are most productive. And then they get into sleep habits and lifestyles. I think that this is pointing to the fact that we can do something, and the job does require us to be up and lose some sleep, but we can create some habits outside of work, and we can minimize other jobs, and we can optimize recovery by taking naps. So this is a important recommendation, I think, as well. The International Association of Fire Chiefs also recommend the use of caffeine, and they have listed other stimulants, and the one specifically they have in there is Provigil, which has the generic name of modafinil, and this is known for being a safer option for shift work sleep disorder. And I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't done enough research. So please let me know if anyone has, and send that info my way so that we can put it out there if it's going to be a useful option. They had listed intervention of education of workers and families, and I like that because it's good to have the firefighter following some recommendations, but it's even better to have a family that supports those recommendations. And they also included naps. So there's some common themes that we're seeing as we're going through some of this literature. This was a paper that was put together by an Australian government program called You First, and it was one of my favorite research papers out of the ones that we've reviewed so far, because the information was current for the most part, and it was practical for what we need here in the fire service. The title is Sleep Disturbance, a Predictor of PTSD, and it seems like a lot of the recent studies are proving that sleep disorders are associated with mental injury. So there's some good studies cited in that research paper. One of the interventions I also really liked, and it's to create a work culture that values sleep, and I wanted to highlight that one to set the tone for the future, and maybe create some thought process on how we can work on that one. And it seems to me that education is going to be the factor there. They go over core components of stress management, being relaxation training, and that's going to be controlled recovery breathing is one thing that we can do. And it's also, I think, going to be the same as tactical breathing that Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman recommends, and that's breathing in for 3, holding for 3, out for 3, hold for 3. Provide adaptive cognitive coping strategies. Using a mantra was a listed recommendation. Encourage daily healthy and social routines, exercise, hobbies. And then the 2 primary prevention strategies listed were increasing employee control, which I think is really interesting, and then promoting physical activity, which is, I think also really good, and something that we knew, but it's interesting that those were the primary prevention strategies. And when it says increasing employee control, I think that can point back to the information that we reviewed about autonomy and what that can do when someone is looking to increase motivation and have that move from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. Dr. Kirk Parsley is a sleep specialist who was a Navy SEAL, then became the doc for the Navy SEALs, and we've talked a little bit about him. And he had some recommendations that I thought were worth including. And those were: evaluate crew sleeping quarters. They need to be quiet, dark, cool, and comfortable. He said allow tired employees to sleep in an extra hour or two, especially when we have to drive home, because that time is a really dangerous time. That's where a lot of the accidents happen. He also said to allow rotation of busy units with slower units, which is interesting, and that might be sharing the swing, or we could possibly think up other recommendations and look at those. He says also to limit the length of time personnel can be assigned to busy companies because of the potential burnout and health problems that result from chronic exposure to sleep deprivation. Now we're going to move into exposures, psychological and physical, and how we can minimize those and the recommendations that are out there. One of the first things I think we need to consider when it comes to exposures is the issue of recovery and the overall allostatic load, because as we discussed in the last presentation, that's going to directly affect our immune system and our ability to perform on scene and limit injury. So that in my mind is going to be primary. So if we're adding a fitness routine into somebody's schedule and they're already stressed, and then we add that, it's just going to complicate the issue, and their prevention through preparation will go down. So we need to provide health and wellness programs, not just fitness programs, because in my mind that's taking into consideration the whole picture. This will also take into consideration some introspection and self-situational awareness. It's important to understand where we are in regard to our overall allostatic load so that we can prevent issues arising from lack of situational awareness and lack of preparation. And education, I think, is going to play a major role in that. And we've discussed a lot of the things here on the bottom in the previous section. I just want to include those for your review. Another quick review: specific adaptation to imposed demands. This was discovered by Hans Seeley, where he found that there was a surge of glucocorticoids when there was a stressful stimulus placed upon mice, was what he discovered, but obviously on everyone. So it's important to take this into consideration because of the nature of adaptation, and if too much stress is applied, then we get maladaptation, and I think that is a little bit more of a concern within the fire service because of the additional issues associated with the job. So it's important to know that, and then understand that we need one goal at a time, because if we're chasing strength and endurance and we want to be the best at both, it's not going to happen. One is going to sabotage the other. But one thing we can do is break those up throughout the year and peak within blocks of time throughout the year. So minimal effective dose while accounting for recovery is going to be key. And you, I'm sure, can remember these slides from the previous presentation. The above information was taken from the Joint Consensus Statement of the European College of Sports Science and American College of Sports Medicine, and this is a paper that I used to describe overtraining and a little bit of the things that we can do to prevent that, and as well as a few other sources of information that are cited at the end of this presentation. The bottom graphic was taken from the Army Resiliency Program, and I really like this graphic because it describes where we need to be in that optimal state, and it's balancing on that peak. And hopefully if we feel a little bit of that fatigue hitting, we'll take time to recover and get that adaptation we're looking for and not slip down into the burnout realm. The size principle is important in regard to injury prevention because if we're not warming up, we're not recruiting all of the muscle fibers that we need to move that weight. And also, fatigue definitely plays a role in this. If we're fatigued, we have a lessened ability to recruit all of the muscle fibers. And then it also gets into the movement literacy and targeting a specific muscle group and having that neuromuscular connection to fire that group that you're working with. And that will translate over to stabilizing joints as you're on maybe a scene where the ground is uneven and you stumble. And then pillar recruitment is important in regard to the needs assessment that we did with the city and all of the back injuries. One of the things that is common with these injuries is the inability to stabilize the core, and then also training while fatigued is going to lessen your ability to stabilize your core. Continuing on with some of the information that I got from the American College of Sports Medicine, they recommend when looking at tracking stress for fitness programs using two different metrics, and that's external load and internal load. External load would be the weight, and what they recommend using is this volume load, which is total weight times total reps. And an example I have here is squatting 3x3 with 100 pounds would equal 900 pounds for that session. And then if it's a cardio session, distance would be the external load. The internal load is what really brings validity to the tracking, because one or the other isn't good enough. We got to use both. Heart rate would be tied to distance, I think. That would be a good way to measure stress for that session, or heart rate variability. And we'll get more into that and explain that here in a minute. Rate of perceived exertion is an excellent way, I think, to teach someone to look at where they are in regard to their stress. And I think this is something we should use, and we should together figure out a way to approach using this. It's a way that we can plan a training session, and it's also a way that we can track that stress. So it's based on the firefighter's current state, and you rate that session by how physically and mentally demanding it was. And then from that, you can go to the next session, and if it's based on RPE, then that'll help prevent overtraining, because if the training session is an RPE of 7 on a fatigue day, that accounts for that fatigue, whereas a percentage-based program doesn't account for fatigue. And I'm not saying we need to use RPE exclusively, but I think we definitely need to incorporate it into our training. And they say use volume load and RPE to get the most out of fitness training and prevent overtraining syndrome. Overtraining syndrome is mainly due to an imbalance in the training recovery ratio. This is what we've been saying throughout the program. We need to understand the stressors being placed on the firefighters so we can understand if they're recovering from that first before we place another stressor on top of that. And then once we've given them a fitness program, we got to make sure that it's not adding additional stress and that it's not progressing faster than they can recover from. So we use that RPE plus load volume like we just discussed. The cognitive fatigue is going to be the first sign of overreaching. And in here, number 7, it says include questionnaires. And that's something I've looked at, and I put something together that I'll present to you in this next presentation. We got to avoid monotony and train to what the individual likes and their level of fitness. And we got to switch it up. Optimal nutrition, hydration, sleep are all going to be huge factors in regard to preventing overtraining. Awareness of overall allostatic load and just understanding the stressors of your life and tracking those and helping the individual understand that fact. We need to also have regular checks from physicians, and we're trying to make this happen yearly so that we can rule out other disease causing factors that may be causing this this fatigue. Take some time to look at this flow chart. It is helping you look at what other things may be causing fatigue and helping you rule out overtraining. Exposure to communicable diseases is a factor that we can manage a little bit, and it is management with prevention and on scene. We can do things to lessen the impact. And one of the things that is crucial is sleep. And we've discussed this a little bit, but in regard to the immune system, we have certain disease fighting chemicals that we create while we're sleeping, and those hormones and proteins our body needs to fight disease are released during that time. So sleep is crucial. Regular fitness is also crucial. This is, in my mind, and it may be incorrect, but I see it as a way to train the immune system through the inflammatory response, because that's basically what the immune function is. It's inflammatory response. And when we train, we make micro tears in our muscle groups, and that is an immune response. And little tiny exposures over time with recovery is basically the definition of adaptation. So that's how I view that. Good nutrition almost goes without saying, but let's talk about some specific things that we need to have a healthy immune system. Vitamin D and magnesium are the two most efficient within the US. So vitamin D is a good one to supplement, but you want to make sure you supplement that with magnesium because that helps synthesize the vitamin D. And probiotics are going to be crucial as well in that regard to keep our gut healthy and good things flowing into our bloodstream. Here's some recommendations from Harvard, and they're similar to what we just reviewed, but they added maintaining a healthy weight, drink in moderation if you drink alcohol. They also added try to minimize stress, which is a huge factor in immune function because chronic stress activates that chronic immune response, which then over time is going to exhaust the system. Gut health has been tied to several issues that are specific to the job that we need to be aware of, and immune function is one of them, cardiac compromise, and mental injury. So I've included a few studies proving those points and leading in that direction. This is still some recent information, so there needs to be more information provided, but I think it's good to be aware of it so that we can supplement our diets with the suggestions you see at the bottom. Most of those are pretty common, I think, except for glutamine. I don't think that people know that that's going to increase the health of your gut, but that's something we can do through eating those foods that you see there or supplementation. In their joint consensus overtraining prevention statement, the European College of Sports Science and the American College of Sports Medicine addressed diets and the cause of excess stress and allostatic overload with those. And with our job, I think this is really important. It's just another element that we need to take into consideration when helping someone. If they are not managing the stress of the job, and then we add a additional stressor of an extreme diet, these studies that are within this document are proving that it's not beneficial in the end for that individual. So if they still would like to do whatever diet they're looking at doing after we give them this information, we do our best to facilitate that choice and give them strategies to perform better on scene on that restriction, as well as how to manage with sleep deprivation and these other things. And that's something that I haven't looked into enough to really create any sort of strategy in that regard. They say that the gradual weight loss is the way to go, and that's 1 to 2 pounds. And the reason is the body goes into that high stress state if it's any more than that. This is a strategy that I put together with the help of Shannon, who's a PhD in nutrition and physiology. Some of you have met her, and she's a great resource. These are general recommendations. They're not meant to be specific, and it's, I think, a decent place to start. Please give me your feedback so that we can add to this and get a little more specific into goals of size increase, strength gains, that sort of thing. Taking that strategy to a 6-day work cycle, this is taking into consideration that pre-diabetic state that we get in when we're sleep deprived, and it's also trying to optimize recovery for the next shift. So this is a strategy that Shannon thought might be a good idea. Let me know what you guys think. To prevent allostatic overload and overtraining, the American College of Sports Medicine has a few recommendations, and these also are recommendations that have been made to monitor fatigue from sleep deprivation and other things that may affect your CNS and reaction time. So the Stroop test is a psychomotor speed test that was recommended, and there's also the TAP test, which is a common assessment as well. And these both you can get as apps online. It's pretty interesting. I've used them and assessed my levels of fatigue, and they're actually validated to use for some studies. And the profile mood states assessment is one that they use for the overtraining specifically, and that's just an overall mood assessment. The autonomic nervous system influences cardiac control, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use heart rate variability to monitor allostatic overload. So the parasympathetic increases vagal tone, which increases heart rate variability, and that is good. We want our heart rate to be variable and to be dynamic with whatever environment we're in. And the sympathetic nervous system, it decreases that vagal tone and decreases variability. So that is the indication that heart rate variability gives us that we may be in an overloaded state. So let's get into that a little bit. Heart rate variability has been around for a long time, since the 1960s, and the American Heart Association has several studies citing the benefit of using it to prevent cardiac events and some other issues that I don't really understand because the literature was so complicated. I couldn't really comprehend what I was reading. But if you're interested, there's more research out there in regard to using heart rate variability. There's a difference between pulse rate variability and heart rate variability. And if you look at the picture on the right, it's showing pulse rate variability, which is looking at the pulse oximetry waveform. And that's not going to be nearly as exact as the heart rate variability, which looks at the R to R intervals. And I think as we use this tool, or if we introduce this tool, we need to have one that gives some precise measurements or some more accurate measurements so that we can come up with a a better approach. We've just gone through a good amount of information and research out there to help us approach these problems within the fire service. And I think it's important to keep in mind what the goal is, and that's resilience and durability. We're not looking for excuses. We're not looking for a explanation of why we are the way we are. We're looking for a way to make things better and to help each other be a little more resilient and durable. So the resiliency piece is not just addressing the physical or just the mental. It's both together. And as we've reviewed this information and as I've kind of dug into it, I've realized that you can't really separate them. And by working on one, you make the other better. And by working on both of them simultaneously, it has a synergistic effect. To conclude another lengthy presentation, I'd like to thank you for listening to this one. I know that I promised that it would be shorter, and this one is actually just slightly shorter. I promise, though, I swear, the next one is not going to be nearly this long. And I'd like to circle back just to finish up with that original study we looked at with the 3,289 firefighters, where they found a significant correlation between the physical injury and the mental injury and their physical state and experience. All of these things are closely related, and we need to take all of them into consideration when putting this program together. And I'm not trying to act like I have all the answers or know, and that's why I'm presenting this information to you, is so that we all can get on the same page and put something together that will last. It's got to be the group, and it's got to be something that other people want to be a part of. And then this final quote is a powerful one. We're developing an understanding of what the issues are, and there's other people that need to know what's going on so that they can take the steps to prevent things from getting worse, and so that they can impact the community better and love their job. So until next time, thank you guys, and let me know, like always, if you have any suggestions or advice for moving forward. Thank you.